What I really want you to think about is when Megan opened the conference this morning, I said that one of the things that I love about podcasting is we're only limited by our imaginations. On this conference, we're only limited by our collective imaginations. But when you're podcasting by yourself, it's equally true. And that's really what I want to try to communicate today is you're only limited by your imaginations. And you can use podcast seasons for a variety of ways, spice up your podcast, enhance monetization of your podcast, break up your podcast into different ways that attract and engage new audiences and listeners, allow you to do different things and create other assets that I think come directly from the podcast. Using seasons to expand your podcast growth. So I have two podcast networks. The first one is in the titillating space of legal and regulatory compliance. Yes, it's a thing. And I have the only podcast network in compliance. It's founded in 2017. I started with 5 shows and I have 75 shows. 60 of those are mine. That's my big network, and the one that's the B2B network. These are some of the numbers. This is where I am through the end of, I guess, September of 2024. This is downloads in this platform. They're called reads because it started as a blogging platform. And when we get to the end, I'm going to have a slide where I try to communicate that I think we are measuring how we communicate with and engage with our audience completely wrongly in the podcast world. One of the reasons is we don't have a coherent definition. Some call it a download, some call it a listen, some call it a read, some call it an impression, some call it engagement. Well, this platform calls it a read, but this is just one of my platforms. So this is the kind of numbers I get on my business-to-business platform. So when I said you're only limited by your imagination, I meant that because legal and regulatory compliance, in my opinion, can be sliced and diced in innumerable ways. So these are just some of the podcasts. I have Sherlock Holmes in compliance, Star Trek in compliance, Star Wars in compliance, Shakespeare in compliance, King Arthur in compliance, data-driven compliance, sports in compliance, James Joyce's Ulysses in compliance, Dante in compliance, Venice in compliance, daily, weekly, and monthly compliance news, great women in compliance into the weeds, panel discussions on compliance, data privacy and compliance. So you're really only limited by your imagination on different ways to slice and dice a subject area, even if your subject area is as niche as legal and regulatory compliance. I have a second network called the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier. I live in a rural part of West Texas, if you can't tell from my accent, and we founded this network in 2022. It started with 3 shows, and now we have 15 shows. And what we're trying to do with this network to see if there is a viable business model for a regionally focused rural podcast network. I put the numbers of subscribers up here for a reason. And that reason is my little hometown has 18,000 people, and we have a 3-day-a-week newspaper. Our newspaper has 3,500 subscribers. So we have 500 subscribers less than the only newspaper in town. We don't have a radio station. It all went internet, and we're too small for a television station. If businesses want to try to get their word out in my little hometown, there's really only a couple of different ways. One is you can advertise in the newspaper, or you can advertise on our podcast network. And that's what we're trying to educate business owners, is that social media marketing is a viable business strategy for getting the word out or marketing. And these are some of the podcasts on our regional network, the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. We had 2 eclipses in 2020, in the last 18 months rather. And so we had an eclipse podcast, have a podcast on diabetes, the metabolic bully. I have 2 artist podcasts, the Hill Country Artist Podcast, and you see at the top, the Magnificent 7, those are 7 women who put on a couple of shows. I have an artist podcast. I have an investing podcast. I have an podcast about a book called The Big Empty. There's a podcast called the Hill Country Podcast, which is Human Interest. We have a museum in town called the Western Museum of Western Art. They have a podcast, and we have a great folk festival. And so they have a podcast as well. So these are the kinds of things you can do locally. So let's talk about seasons. And I'm going to go through some of these podcasts that I have put together and talk about how I've used seasons. This one is the Corruption Files, and it goes into the Compliance Podcast Network. Compliance, one flavor of compliance is anti-corruption or anti-bribery compliance. So we're in season 2 of the Corruption Files. And season 1, we did a U.S. corruption. And in season 2, we did pre-2000. So we looked at corruption cases from the last century. We're going to do a post-2000. And for those keeping score at home, that means post-Enron and then international. But there's lots of different ways to look at corruption. And so we're doing it season by season on the Corruption Files. This one probably is my personal favorite, and it's called Adventures in Compliance. It's lessons from the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And there are 56 A. Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes short stories and 4 novels. And so I wanted to do the entire oeuvre of Sherlock Holmes in a podcast. I started out with The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. That's the first collection of short stories. There are 5 books that are just collections of short stories that appeared in the magazine The Strand from basically the late 1890s through the middle 1920s. And that's how prolific Conan Doyle was. So I'm in the last collection of short stories called the Case Book of Sherlock Holmes. And each one of those books has been a season. I've got the novels coming up. And then, much to my wife's, I think, disheartenment, I've decided we're going to do the movies as well. And that's the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce classic Sherlock Holmes movies. And then, of course, there are TV treatments. There was a lengthy show on PBS with Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes. And more recently, there's been another series of TV shows involving Sherlock Holmes. This, for me, was really just an excuse to reread all these stories and talk about them. But it's given me seasons upon seasons of content. And it's amazing how many people like hearing about compliance through the story of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this is Megan and mine's podcast. And the full title is Because That's What Heroes Do. And I will let Megan tell you where that title came from. But I was particularly thrilled that this podcast won a Davy Award. And Megan is the ultimate MCU geek. And so we decided we wanted a podcast where we could go through every MCU movie. And we started out maybe talking about compliance, but it's certainly evolved into less compliance and more geekdom. But what we have done here is we decided we had so much fun going through the MCU phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 that then we expanded out when the MCU went to television series. So we had Loki. Then, of course, when Star Wars had television series, we had Star Wars television series. We haven't done the full Star Wars oeuvre because I did that on another series. And then Megan knows of my ultimate love of Star Trek. So she said, I know somebody who knows more about Star Trek than you, and we need to get him on a podcast. So we did. And his name is Murphy. So Megan, Murphy, and I are we started off doing our 15 favorite episodes from Deep Space Nine. And where it goes from now, I can only say Agatha is next on our list. Agatha all the time. So the different series that Megan and I have done have become different seasons on because that's what heroes do. And you'll see at the bottom, I changed the title a little bit because I wanted to honor Murphy when he came on to join us. And you can just change the title out to whatever series you're going through. Certainly the first 17 or 20, whatever the MCU was, that was appropriate. but it lets the audience know, hey, this series is on Deep Space Nine. It may have started out to be 15 episodes, but it can certainly expand beyond that. Now we get to Star Trek. And this is another way to use seasons. So I am the ultimate Trekkie. I grew up with Star Trek, the original series. I've always loved it, still watch it, have all the episodes. Whatever geekdom you are in Star Trek, I'm with you. And I absolutely love it. So in 2017, I committed to doing the full TOS, or the original series, over one summer. Now, for every Star Trek geek out there, TOS was 79 episodes. So I had 80 episodes because I had an introduction and I did the 79. And I did them in release order date. And it was hugely successful. And I had so much fun that I thought in 2018, I thought I ought to do this again. So we had season 2, except it was the same as season 1. And then the next year, in 2019, I decided, well, if I'm going to run it again, maybe I should put some new material in. So I did. And I've done that literally every year. And this year, I decided to completely recommit and redo everything. So I redid the show notes, I redid the analysis, and I'm looking at compliance, leadership, and business ethics through the lens of trekking through compliance. Well, in 2024, I had higher numbers than I had in 2017. So people are out there listening, and they're listening because they love Star Trek too. They like hearing how Star Trek can give them insights into corporate compliance, business leadership, and business ethics. And I absolutely love this. And as my wife said, yeah, I know, it's just another excuse to rewatch the original 79 original episodes. Like, yeah, true. But I get a podcast series out of it. And every year I get a podcast series out of it. And frankly, you ever want to gin up your numbers in the summer, bump it up by 20,000 a month? That's the way to do it. Rerun your greatest series. So you can repurpose what you have. And I'm going to go through some later examples of that. But this is a way for you to podcast about what you love, give your audience things that they want to listen to, put yourself out there with Star Trek. And of course, people wrote me and said, hey, can I be on a guest episode? Or I love that episode. I love this. I love that. And it's a way for great audience engagement. So trekking through compliance is a prime example of basically using the same show and tweaking it a little bit and getting very good numbers. And this is the prime example of, in the summer, it's a daily. So starting June 1, and I give advertisers 7 days a week of advertising. And so that can get some advertising heads turned because they see the value in that burst of advertising. And so you might want to think about, how can you position yourself for making yourself more attractive to an advertiser by basically repurposing something you already have. So use what you have, use what you love, and you can repurpose it and turn it into a new season. So let's move over to the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. So about 6 months ago, I met this guy named CJ Goodwin, and he's a movie producer. And he got me thinking, I want to have a movie podcast of people in the movie industry in the Hill Country. And he was the first person I met. So I interviewed him for my signature or anchor podcast on the Hill Country Podcast Network, which is the Hill Country Podcast. And he talked to us about his latest movie, which is called Into the Darkness, Sherlock Holmes, Mayor of the Night. And he takes, obviously with my love of Holmes, I was very interested in this, but he takes a very different version of Holmes, which is essentially, Holmes is a man, he's a human. What happens when a human sees all of the evil that Holmes has seen over his life? Does he get PTSD? Does he have a breakdown? Does he go turn to drugs and alcohol? What happens to Sherlock Holmes? And so that's the vision of this director and this movie. That's why it's called Into the Darkness. But I said to CJ, how about we do a 10-part series on your movie and we make it essentially a masterclass in independent filmmaking, and you can use it to publicize your movie. It premieres in end of January. And he said, let's do it. So I did a 10-part series with CJ, two about himself being the producer, writing the script and directing it. But then we focus on the cast and crew. So we've had the sound person, we've had the first assistant director, we had the makeup artist, we've had 4 of the actors, and it's a 10-part series about what CJ Goodwin's vision is. Well, I'm cross posting that on my movie podcast for the Texas Hill Country, which is Real Creators of the Texas Hill Country. And it's season 1. And the way I'm doing it is Into the Darkness and Real Creators run every other week. I'm getting great coverage for CJ and his movie, and I'm getting 2 podcasts literally for the price of 1. It's not seasons in the sun, but it shows how you can repurpose a podcast and draw different listeners and watchers, because I'm a big believer in posting your video on YouTube. Think about 2 for the price of 1. How could you rename it or remarket it so that it would be attractive for both listeners and potentially marketers and advertisers as well? So artists and their crafts. There is an incredibly vibrant art scene in this little part of Texas. And my wife and I started going to art shows literally the first couple of months after we moved here in 2021. And we met a woman named Deanna Eichsman. And so I asked her if I could interview her about her work as an artist, and she said, sure. And it turned out she had a bunch of girlfriends who were artists. And when I say girlfriends, I mean, I think the youngest is 62. These are women who are mostly retired, but were either have been artists all their lives, taught art in high school. One woman actually took it up at age 68. And so it's a variety of artists. And I got a great series, the Hill Country Artist Podcast, just talking to local artists. Well, it turned out that Deanna and 6 of her friends had a show which they call the Magnificent Seven. And second year of the show was 2024. So I asked them, these ladies, could we do a podcast about your art and your show? Because they show it together at our local arts center. And once again, they said, sure, that'd be great, Tom. And I'm not quite sure what my vision was, but it turned into almost an exploration of the painting artist's creation process. So I've written a lot of books and I understand that process, but I'm not an artist, painting artist. And of course, the process for each creation was different for each woman. So it was a fabulous exploration. Now the show ended in mid-October, and I thought about what I had learned in interviewing these women. And I thought, well, we should keep going on this. So we've just concluded recording season 2 and of the Magnificent Seven. And what season 2 is basically an artist throughout the year. What do they paint? Now, most of these women paint landscapes, a few paint animals, and the landscape changes. And so what do they see differently? Do they see it differently in their head? The light is different in winter than it is in summer and in the fall and in the spring. So we went in this deep exploration of kind of the time of the year for painting. And it was really, for me, just a fabulous exploration. Well, that's season 2. And then, of course, what are you painting now? What are you thinking about? Are you going to have any shows? Are you painting something for Christmas? Are you taking commissions? Sort of all of those things. And then we're going to play season 2 in this final quarter of 2024. And then in Q1, we'll do sort of a winter spring season. I really, as with many of the things I do in podcasting, I stumbled across this. And when I did one series, I realized there's more of the story to tell. So think about that as a way to have a different season. This one, From Last to First, the John Assetti story. This is one I was not able to have a season two for a reason I'll explain in a minute. I met John Assetti in Kerrville, in my little hometown, and he had written a book about business leaders in Kerrville. So I have an author's podcast. I could interview him, and he said, sure. So I interviewed him, and at the end, we were talking, and he said, well, how old do you think I am? And I said, well, mid-80s maybe. Well, he's 94. He wrote his first book when he was 78. And I thought, that's a pretty good story. And he had a really interesting life. And then he proceeds to tell me, well, I've always wanted to do my autobiography. Looked at him and I said, well, what's stopping you? You've written 7 books starting when you were 78. He goes, well, this or that or whatever. And I just said, stop it. We're going to do your autobiography. And here's how we're going to do it. You're going to write me 10 one-page outlines of the chronology of your life. I'm going to record you on that. And then that is going to form the basis of the transcripts of each of those will form the basis of a chapter of your autobiography. And the rest is up to you. So sure enough, we did that. It was a great podcast series. He got an autobiography out of it. The podcast series went up last fall. The book came out last fall. And fortunately, he passed away at 95 in February. We didn't get to do season 2, but we were going to do season 2 of the John Assetti story. And so if you have anyone older in your family who's not told your story, I mean, I don't know about you, but I never heard my dad tell stories. So I would have loved to have had an autobiography of my father like I got from John Assetti. So I didn't get to have a season 2 with John, but that's a kind of thing you can do with that type of project. Or if you have aunts and uncles or older cousins, you can do the same thing for your family, because this was the greatest gift for his kids, to get an autobiography of their father, to hear stories they'd never heard. Not a new season, but so if you want to own your space in podcasting, start a daily news show. I don't care what your area of podcasting is. If you do a daily show, that drives listenership, it drives engagement, it drives people to your site, because number one, you're on every day. Number two, it shows a level of commitment that is, you'll be in the 99.99% percentile of committed podcasters, and it'll make you a better podcaster in your field. So I have a daily news show. I started this in 2018, I think. And I started getting emails from people. We love this, but we really need a weekend wrap up. I'm like, really? Now this daily compliance news is 5 minutes. It's 4 stories. You can't listen to 5 minutes of a podcast on a daily basis. I didn't ask that question, but I thought it. Nevertheless, I thought, okay, well, if people want curated stories on the weekend, I'll give it to them. So I started 10 for 10, which is 10 top compliance stories, and that comes out on Saturday. 10 for 10 gets better numbers than the Daily Show gets. Wish I could explain it to you, but I can't. I just know it's a thing. So it's not a new season, but it's not even derivative. It's just sort of repurposing what I do daily on the weekend. Do you have something that you can do like that? Sorry for this picture, but after that last presentation on the use of AI, you can see what AI can do for you. If you want your image and somebody else did this, I can't and won't take credit for it. Nevertheless, podcasting to create other assets. This podcast series started as a book, which became a 10-part podcast series. And that led to me getting hired by this company because they wanted to release 4 books a year in the business space of legal and regulatory compliance. So this podcast a book led to this podcast. Well, now I'm doing a podcast, which is going to lead to a book. The number of assets you can create from a podcast are once again only limited by your imagination. And along those lines, the Podcasting for Business book. Now, we all heard Megan talk about this morning. I've had the privilege to read this book, and I have learned a ton from it, and I quote from it all the time. But I approached Megan after I had read, I was one of the beta readers of her book, and I said, hey, would you consider doing a podcast series on your book to promote it for its opening? And you know about Megan, and you know what she said. You bet. Let's do it. So we did a relatively short, about 15 minutes per episode, but we did 10 episodes. And it created a almost evergreen set of social media marketing materials for her book promotion. And then we used that, or she used that, to flip that in to the conference. Podcasting to promote other assets. Once again, not a season, but another use of the podcast format. Okay. This came to me from Katie Krimitos. And Katie, she's the wife of Chris Krimitos, and Katie and Chris run Podfest Expo. And so one of the books I've written is a handbook on compliance. And it's a 500 or 600 page book, sort of my signature book. Well, how Katie comes into this, she has a series of podcasts on meditation, focusing on meditation for women. And I heard her say at Podfest this year, she has taken some of the meditations and created a daily meditation. And I thought, well, wow, what a great idea. And I bet I could get a tip of the day out of my book. That's literally what I do. I have a 5-minute compliance tip of the day. It comes out of my handbook. I put my handbook link in the show notes, so it's driving a few sales. And once again, it's a daily compliance tip, one thing that a compliance professional can digest and hopefully input into their compliance program at little or no cost. So if you have a book, why not create a tip of the day based upon your book? Drive sales to your book as well. Okay, so I am nearing the end, and this is really the last thing I want to talk about. I realize it's unrelated to Seasons in the Sun, but this is the 2023 numbers across my podcast network. And you see the number of categories. And what I would ask you to think about for your podcast is, are you looking at only IAB certified downloads? So if you look at my network summary, you see Megaphone with the 340,000. Now, this is a network, this is not one show, but in 2023, that is downloads. That's IAB certified downloads. Well, now look at JD Supra. That's a non-IAB certified download. And why is that number you saw at the start of my presentation with reads? They call the 1.8 million, what I've called an impression, they call that a read. And then look at LinkedIn, 421, Twitter, 414, Facebook, 166, down at YouTube, 2 million. They all call these something different. And so if someone says, what are your numbers? And you say, well, I have 50,000 downloads, or I have 30,000 downloads, or I have 100 downloads. That is a minuscule amount of your total audience engagement. And so I would ask you to think about, what platforms are you on, and are you getting the numbers? All of these numbers are read. You have to work to figure it out how to get the numbers, but they're there. And it's information you can get as the podcast host on these platforms. And you can show to a advertiser or a company you're trying to market to, this is my numbers. This is the reach I have. This is the number of pieces of engagement. This can get people's attention in a way that when you say, well, I have 5,000 downloads, it's much different. So I just would ask you to start thinking about this. This was part of the original presentation I was going to do, and I'm very passionate about it. So that's why I put it in here. This is my contact information. I'm happy to talk to anybody about any of this. I have a ton and a half materials. My position is I will share anything with anyone for any reason at any time. Love working with Megan, and really love what she's doing with this conference. So with that, I'm going to stop my share, Megan.
Perfect. And we'll come back into gallery view here. Tom, that was great. I always am a little apprehensive listening to your presentations because I know by the end I'm going to be thinking, I should have a daily podcast. And that's one of the major risks. So thank you for sharing all this. I love the creativity with which you've approached different seasons and how you can use the medium of podcasting to achieve so many different things in different areas of business and in life. I know I've got a couple of questions, but first I'll open it for the room. Does anyone have any questions for Tom? Go ahead and just unmute and ask. Oh, John, your audio's not coming. Yeah. We're getting you're in and out a little bit. Yeah, John, if you want to type that into the chat, if somebody else wants to go first, go for it, and then we'll swing right back around. Okay, I'll go with one. Well, John's writing his question there. And so can you just share a little bit about your thought process, Tom, when you want to bring something that's kind of more creative or more to your personal interests into a podcast season or a series on a larger podcast? How do you kind of make the connection between this thing that you're interested in and your kind of main or key or business area topic? So like Sherlock Holmes and compliance, how do you make those two things mesh really well into a cohesive body of work?
Well, for better or worse, I see compliance in everything. So Sherlock Holmes in compliance, Shakespeare in compliance, Winnie the Pooh in compliance. Tigger 2 will teach you compliance lessons. So it's my job to draw out the compliance lessons and present that to the listener. And I absolutely love doing that. So it's almost a labor of love, but that's just the way I see the world.
Perfect. I've got John's question in the chat here. Is there a rule of thumb to the number of episodes that make up a solid season?
For better or worse, I'm a DECA guy, so it's a minimum of 10. I've occasionally gone as low as 8, sometimes 12, but I pretty much try to stick to 10. Just that number is burned in my head.
Gigi's wondering, how do you manage breaks between seasons, saying that it can be scary, trusting that listeners will come back after a pause?
The key is communication with your audience. Let them know how long you've been gone. Start talking about it at the end of your outro. We're going to take a break next week, December 3rd to December 3rd will be our last show in 2024. We're going to be prepping up for 2025, or we're going to start working on our next season, and we will be back with you. The key is communication. So put that in your show notes, put that in your podcast. No one will punish you. No one will be mad at you if you tell them. If you go away for a month, then they're going to go, where's Gigi or where's Tom? But if you've communicated with them, that's what a brand is. A brand is a promise delivered, and your promise to the audience, hey, I'll be back on January 3rd of 2025.
Tony is wondering, are your ads direct sold or do you have a rep firm? And if so, who is it?
So I just hired or started working with a ad rep. I met a guy at Podcast Movement this summer, and so we're going to see if that works. The others have been direct sold.
It's wondering, for an audio podcast, are there any podcast hosting companies that are particularly set up to support seasons?
They're all set up to support seasons. That is entirely to you, whatever you want to do. Every platform I've been on Libsyn. I'm now on Megaphone, and you just say episode 1 through 10, season 1.
From a tech standpoint, I do like Megaphone's season functionality. They have it broken out in a little bit more, like rather than saying it's the season, they actually have a different
That's
kind of, option for it.
when you input all of the information in addition to the episode number, you can put the season. So that information will come up on the metadata of the individual podcasts on Megaphone.
Sharon says, I'm launching a small business podcast. If each episode covers different things, then what is the benefit of having seasons versus episodes only in an ongoing show? Good question.
It just gives you a different way to break things up. Let's say I have a compliance consulting practice, and say I want to focus on leadership, corporate culture for 10 episodes. Then I want to focus on policies and procedures. Then I want to focus on internal controls. and I want to focus on investigations. You can break it up by topics. And if you do that, when you record them, each podcast becomes a blog. 5 blogs is a white paper. 3 white papers is a chapter. And you've got a book at the end of the process.
Kelly's wondering, how far ahead do you prepare your shows before airing them?
Well, the daily compliance news is prepared the night before because I want to get the most current news. Just before I started this presentation, I was posting podcasts in December. That's about as far out as I'll go, just because it's so hard for me to keep it all in my head.
I'm wondering, what's the next season you're going to be doing?
Well, I think I'm halfway through the end of the casebook of Sherlock Holmes. So that means I get to go to the novels, then the movies, if I can somehow con my wife into letting me watch them at night. And my suspicion is that Megan Murphy and I will find a way to extend our trio partnership on all things Star Trek. So that's probably coming as well.
There's a lot of DS9 we haven't really talked about yet. Just saying. But anyway, back to seasons. When it's like if someone's planning their first podcast, Tom, and they're trying to decide between having an ongoing show where all episodes kind of follow the same format or are really disparate, or having seasons that are built around different specific topics, how do you advise someone to make that decision?
Megan, for a business podcast, I'm really leaning towards advising on seasons because it gives you a way to focus your marketing. And I think the Gallo brothers from Ethico that we work with together. And I was explaining to one of the co-CEOs, let's do a 10-part series per quarter and have one focus, but you make that your marketing effort in that quarter, leading to something at the end of that quarter, whether it's a white paper, whether it's a toolkit, whether it's a giveaway. And so if you have a business, it allows you to focus what you want to focus your overall marketing efforts, because your podcasts are not all your marketing efforts. It's a part of, but always remember, and Megan hit this on the head today, which it was so spot on, I'm going to steal it. The podcast is actually a small part of your overall marketing because it's your social media marketing that is so critical. And the assets you create, and the way she phrased it was, you give those away to your customers to show how good you are as a podcaster. Like, brilliant. That's exactly what I do. I tell people, oh, no, I don't want to talk numbers. Let me show you what I can do for you first. And so that showing them what to do is I give them 4 videograms per episode. I write out all the social media shares, the tweets, the links in Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. And so they can, if they choose to, post on their side, but it's the assets that are so valuable that are a part of your overall integrated marketing efforts.
I love it. And I've got one more. And if anyone else has any more, pop them into the chat or feel free to unmute. But do these strategies that you're talking about, because you've got a large audience, you've got all of these shows and you've got a bunch of people listening, can it work the same way for someone who has a much smaller audience or who is earlier in the podcasting journey? Or are there kind of amendments to this type of strategy that they should employ?
No, I think it just depends on if you want to do, like I suggested with my friends at Ethico, you want to have a sort of a quarterly or a half-year marketing focus. That's one thing to do. But remember what Megan taught us this morning or talked to us about with the different types of podcasts. If you want to show your thought leadership, maybe seasons are not the way to go. Maybe just an interview podcast with another thought leader. If you want to create content, maybe it's just that you're creating content through your podcast, leading towards a book or something else. So it also really ties into your strategy behind your overall podcast strategy and the type of podcast you might be focusing on.
Amazing. Tom, thank you so much for this. This was amazing. I really appreciate you sharing all of this interesting work that you're doing with the Compliance Podcast Network and the Hill Country Network, and of course, for being part of the Podcasting for Business Conference yet again.
My pleasure. If anybody wants anything, just reach out. I'll see what I can do to help you.